These are my top 10 tips for painting trees. So the first one is to paint the trunk when it's wet so it gets a cylindrical feel. So I've got around number 6. I'm going to come in and create a trunk with a little bit of water. And dip into some sap green. Just run that along the edge. So this is one side. Rinse that out. And then I'm going to dip into some sepia. This is neat sepia. I'm going to run that along this edge. And can you see it running? So this does all the work for you, creating that shadow on the tree, the dark side and the light side. You can come all the way up to the top. You can add a little bit more in places. A little bit more that side as well, and it just blends over and you get a really nice cylindrical feel. So my next tip is to turn your painting upside down when you're painting branches. It is much easier. So this is a rigger size 2. I'm going to dip into a little bit of the sepia. Much easier to paint downwards and get a nice stroke for a branch than it is to paint upwards. To get to that fine point is much easier, and this applies for all trees. These fine branches are much easier to paint downwards. So I'm just resting on my little finger, a bit of sepia, and working these out. And turn that back round. You see, perfect tree. So, another sheet of paper. My next tip is to do the foliage first, the branches and trunks after. So what I've got here is a natural sponge. I'm just going to pop a bit of green into a little bit of water. My rule is about half a teaspoon of water to a pea-sized blob of paint. I'm just going to dab this off on the kitchen towel to make sure that it's not got excess water in. So I've wrung it out, I've dabbed it off. I'm going to pick up some of that colour and I'm going to dab in. So this is creating the foliage first. So all those little bobbly bits on the natural sponge are working to our advantage. When I dab, I turn the sponge when I lift up, so it's always at a different angle, the same angle, and it won't look natural. So I'm going to dab these in, and you basically end up with floating foliage. Give that a little wring out. However, it is then very easy to fill in a tree. So if I start with a little bit of the sap green, again going in with wet paint first means that if I put the dark paint on after, it's going to give that cylindrical feel. So I'm still using tip number 1. So we've got this main trunk coming through. But what you can do is use the gaps between the foliage to help to define the trunk of the tree. So if you've got more of a spring tree or a summer tree, the foliage comes over. And this gives you a really good guide as to where you need to go to. So I'm popping this sepia in now. I'm using my round number 6. So I can just come in between in the white bits. If I take a branch off here, so I know where my foliage is, I'm coming in between. I don't want any hovering foliage, so I can just pick those bits up in between. Another little one here. Another one there. If I swap down to my rigger so it's a bit finer, and I can do the same, which is just pick out little bits that go in between. You can get a nice effect. You can do this upside down as well. This works equally just as well. You can see I'm just popping in the branches on the white bits in between. It's nice and easy. The sponge has done the work for you. Okay, and we're on to another sheet of paper. Over here. Right, so the next tip number 4, is do distant trees with a flat brush wet in wet. So if I take a little bit of water on here, I'm picking up a round number 10, and I'm just going to take in a little bit of a sky. So this is just dabbed into cobalt blue. There's always sky behind trees. You should always put your sky in. And then I'm going to go to a flat brush. So this is a 1 centimetre flat brush. I'm going to wet it. I'm going to dab it off. I'm going to dip half into raw sienna, half into sap green. Then if I come on here, I'm keeping the brush vertical, I'm tapping, and I'm rolling the brush between my fingers. This is going to create a lovely distant tree effect. So if I dab into a bit of the green, dab into a bit of the raw sienna, then come on again. Rolling that brush between my fingers, keeping upright, tapping the paper. If I dab into a little bit of cobalt blue and a little bit of sap green, I can then take some darker bits in. It's a really nice, natural, soft way of getting distant trees. Okay, so my next tip is to roll the brush when you're creating the branches. So I am going to take this one away and come back to this one. I'm going to turn myself back upside down because I find that easier to get to a point, and I'm going to show you what I mean by rolling the brush. So if I load up this rigger with a bit of sepia, I'm going to hold the brush quite far down, and it's very similar to how I've just done those distant trees. If when you bring a branch off you roll the brush between your fingers, that sort of rolling motion, you'll get a much more natural branch. It takes you out of control a little bit, but it works. So I'm just rolling. This works for brambles, it works for grasses, but it's very, very good for branches. Rolling between my fingers. So you just got to watch what I'm doing with my fingers. I'm doing this rolling motion. Still very light, and it will send the branches in all different directions, which is what a tree does. It's not all uniform. So this really works to create a nice random tree. That brings me on to my next point. I'll twizzle back round. Is always stagger your branches. So you will see I've got one coming off here, one there, one there, one there, one there, one further down, one separate, one more there, none there, one there quite thin, one there a bit further down, a bit thicker. You must always stagger them to make your tree look natural. And just to explain why, let's do another tree. I'll do a tree without staggering them. So I'm coming on with a bit of sap green again. And a bit of sepia. And then I'm going to not stagger. I'm going to put them in exactly the same place on either side. And you can already see why that doesn't work. It doesn't look as natural. It looks like it's too patterned. Even if then I try and take on some branches, turn upside down again, that underlying structure is still there. So it just looks a little bit odd, and you can't really say why, but that is why. So always stagger. Okay, so next tip is always do, unless you're in snow, a jaggedy bottom. So by a jaggedy bottom, I mean this. So this has got a few bits that go into the ground. So when you come to do the ground, it sits quite nicely in there. If you have a tree trunk that finishes like this, in the foreground, it just looks odd. The only time that doesn't look odd is if it's snow. You can soften in a solid background, a solid bottom, and that will work much better. That's touching in with a little bit of water. I'll take this one away. So my next tip is to use dry brushing. So I've got a round number 10, some some sap green and I've loaded the brush. This works best with a rougher paper. I'm going to hold the brush quite flat so the brush is going to catch the surface of the paper. It's fairly loaded, and I'm just going to move it round in an arch. You can see where it's catching the surface. That's because it's flat. I'm literally scraping the brush. I'm not dabbing, I'm scraping the surface of the paper. Then I can come in with some sepia. So this works great for distant trees, it works great for winter trees when you're using a bit of a grey. It works great for summer trees as well. So I'll just do a different type of tree now. So this is around number 6 I'm coming through with, and a little bit of sepia. So it just shows you how quickly you can achieve a really realistic looking tree. It's quite nice as well when the dry brushing is still quite wet because it blends in and gives a natural sort of shadow. So it's blending in places. And you can use those little white gaps to know where you're going to pop your branches and your trunk. So it all works really well in that way as well. If the tree's in the distance, the best thing to do is to just soften in that bottom or do a jaggedy bottom. Tip 9 now, and this tip is to use a credit card chopped up or a bank card chopped up. I've got a little bit, or a loyalty card, a little bit ready to go, to add texture to a tree trunk. So I need a tree trunk. This works best in foreground. I'm going to pop in, this is just the sap green. You get a nice big tree trunk for us to work on. Just going to pop some sepia in. So we're going through tip number 1 again, which is that wet paint and let it do the work and it will create that cylindrical feel. Sap green's a great colour for the mossiness on trees. So I'm just coming down either side. I need a fair bit of dark in this one to show you this technique. Okay, so I've got this piece of card and I'm going to arch as I go. I'm going to hold it flat, I'm going to scrape as I go. So this is just going to create a really nice texture. What you've got to be careful of is that you don't create a pattern, so I want you to overlap some of them and you're scraping out the light. So this is a great technique for rocks, which I've showed you on some tutorials and I'm sure I'll show you again. You see how I'm just scraping across? And then leaving that paint to settle, overlap a few, so you don't end up with a pattern. You can actually as well, if you want to stop a pattern for me straight away, is scrape back a little bit. That scrape back will also add that sort of upwards arch, just creates it to look more cylindrical. The other thing you can do is use the corner to scratch in, and that will indent into there. You can get some vertical texture happening. So where it's really wet and I'm indenting, I'm getting dark lines. Where it's nearly dry, I'm scraping out with the indent, and that's just the corner. And you're creating that sort of bark effect really nice and easily. Okay. So my last tip is to use a combination of all of these together. So I'm going to quickly show you that. What I've got here is just I've lightly sponged with, this is a very fine natural sponge, some masking fluid on, because I want some light areas to be there as well. That's dried, and I'm just going to come on with some water. So this is really just to show you how you can combine all of these techniques and get a really lovely tree. So on my round number 10, I'm going to dip into, loaded with water, dip into some cobalt blue. So I've got some sky. There's always sky behind trees. That's a tip, I'm telling you, without it even being on the tip list. Behind trees is not white, it's sky. So I'm just going with a very pale sky. I'm going to dip into some of the sap green, some of the raw sienna. So this is just to show you that you can do the same thing that I did with the flat brush with the round brush. It's just not so easy to see it, so you've got to be a bit more considered when you're dabbing in to make sure you're getting both on the brush. And I'm just dabbing through now, so a bit of each colour. I'm making sure that I'm coming around that masking fluid so that that's not going to be hovering later on its own. It's going to have some light green and some darker green. So it's nice and wet and it's softening in lovely. Because the paint's nice and thick and my brush is nicely dry, it's not going too far anywhere. It's not spreading too far. Okay, I'm going to dry that off. I've dried that off. I've got this half a teaspoon of water with a pea-sized blob of sap green in. I'm just going to take a tiny dab of cobalt blue in there. I want that to be a little bit darker now to work over here. I'm going to use my sponge, which I've wrung out, dabbed off really well, and I'm going to come in to this slightly darker green mix, and I'm going to work over what I've got. So I've got a wet in wet background of colour. I'm now going to start to build up some foliage on top of that. You see that lovely texture appearing. You don't want it to get too wet. I'm going to pick up my round number 6 and a little bit of the sepia and then start to work in to create the trunk. With a jaggedy bottom, come in and just break through using that technique where I can see the sky blue of the paper and where the sponge hasn't gone, and I can just pick those bits up and come through so that I know where my trunk's going to go. And then I can pull out a few branches, making sure that I stagger those branches from the trunk. You come through, you want to make sure you haven't got any floating foliage, so you want a branch going to different places so you know that it's not floating. So I'm staggering again, look, staggering the bottom will bring this down. We can go there, come through, just picking out these little bits. You can add an odd branch in if there isn't a gap as well, it does still work. I can come down to my rigger. Pop in any really fine branches. If you want any of those wispy branches that come out at the top of the foliage, you can do a few of those. I can turn upside down. To do those really fine ones towards the top. Can use the little bit of credit card just to do a couple of scratches on here to create a bit more texture. So you see how I'm using all of those methods together, all of those tips to make a fabulous tree. I can just soften in that bottom section here. I'm just dabbing a little bit of green. Okay, I'll dry that off and rub the masking fluid off. Rub the masking fluid off the tree now, and what you can see is I've got these patches, and that's where the sponge works really well, because those patches look like areas of foliage that are on branches in their own right, so it just tends to work quite nicely. And what I'm going to do with each of those is just dab into my raw sienna. Hopefully it's nice and clean. That wasn't the cleanest of raw sienna. And just colour them in. So my brush is loaded with water, but I'm dabbing into the neat raw sienna. You don't have to be too precise because this is a yellow. It won't really show very much on the green. It's just giving you that lighter tone in the tree. If it's too thick, just dab a bit more water on. I just want you to colour in all of those areas so that they start to become part of the tree. And then the last thing you need to do is to just take a little bit of this green over. So it's that same dark green, and you're just going to dab in. You can still be wet, and that will just break that up a little bit. So you see how I'm dabbing in, and it breaks that patch up to become part of the tree. It's a really nice effect to get those lighter areas on a tree. So that's my top 10 tips. Hope you've enjoyed it.